Born Grace Morgan in 1989, she grew up in a middle-class family in Savannah, Georgia. Her father, Andrew, was a high school history teacher, and her mother, Margaret, worked as a nurse. Grace was the younger of two children, with an older brother, Ryan, who was 3 years her senior. From an early age, Grace showed a keen intelligence and a drive to succeed. She excelled in school, particularly in English and debate. Her teachers often remarked on her ability to analyze complex situations and articulate her thoughts. Clearly, this skill would serve her well in her future career and in unraveling the mystery that would consume her life. Grace's childhood wasn't without challenges. When she was 14, her parents went through a bitter divorce. The experience left a lasting impact on Grace, instilling in her a deep-seated fear of betrayal and a determination to build a stable, loving family of her own. She threw herself into her studies, using academic success as a way to cope with the turmoil at home. Her hard work paid off when she was accepted to Emory University on a partial scholarship. At Emory, Grace majored in communications and minored in psychology, fascinated by the ways people interact and communicate. It was during her sophomore year that she met Reynolds at a campus mixer. Eric, a senior studying business administration, was immediately drawn to Grace's quick wit and warm smile. Their relationship blossomed quickly. Eric's confidence and ambition complemented Grace's intelligence and empathy. By the time Grace graduated, they were already talking about marriage. They tied the knot 2 years later in a beautiful ceremony attended by friends and family from both sides. After college, Grace's career in marketing took off. She had a natural talent for understanding consumer behavior and crafting compelling campaigns. By the age of 30, she had risen to the position of marketing executive at a prominent advertising firm in Savannah. Throughout her rise in the corporate world, Grace never lost sight of her dream of having a family. She and Eric had always planned to have children, but as the years went by, they struggled with infertility. The experience was emotionally draining, but it seemed to bring them closer together. Or so Grace thought. The early years of Grace and Eric's marriage were a whirlwind of excitement and shared dreams. They bought their first home together, a charming 4-bedroom colonial that they planned to fill with children. Weekends were spent renovating the house, exploring local farmers markets, hosting dinner parties for their growing circle of friends. Eric's career as a management consultant meant frequent business trips, often lasting several days. Grace initially found the separations difficult, but grew accustomed to them over time. She filled her days with work, yoga classes, and volunteer activities at the local animal shelter. When Eric was home, they made the most of their time together, taking romantic weekends away or simply curling up on the couch with a bottle of wine and a good movie. Their friends often commented on how in love they still seemed, even after years of marriage. Grace and Eric finished each other's sentences, laughed at inside jokes, and always presented a united front. They were the couple others aspired to be. But as the years went by, subtle changes began to creep into their relationship. Eric's business trips became more frequent and longer in duration. He was often distracted when he was home, constantly checking his phone or stepping away to take calls. Grace attributed this to the stress of his job and did her best to be understanding. First real crack in their perfect facade appeared on their 10th wedding anniversary. Eric, who had always made a big deal out of anniversaries, forgot the date entirely. He was away on a business trip and didn't call until late in the evening. When Grace reminded him, he was apologetic, but seemed distracted. It was a small thing, but it planted a seed of doubt in Grace's mind. Little did she know, this seed would soon grow into a tangled web of suspicion and deceit. The pivotal moment that would change Grace's life forever came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in April. She had taken a half-day off work, prepare for a dinner party they were hosting that weekend. While searching for a specific serving platter in the guest room closet, Grace stumbled upon a shoebox she didn't recognize. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened it. Inside, she found a collection of items that made her blood run cold. A second cell phone, a small stack of birthday and Father's Day cards addressed to Daddy in a child's handwriting, and several photos of Eric with a woman and 2 young children Grace had never seen before. Her hands shaking, Grace examined the photos more closely. They showed Eric looking happy and relaxed with his arms around a beautiful brunette woman. 2 children, A boy who looked about 7 and a girl who appeared to be around 5 smiled up at the camera. The background of several photos suggested a house, not a hotel room or vacation spot. Grace's mind raced. Was this an old relationship Eric had never mentioned? But the children looked too young for that to be the case. The most recent Father's Day card was dated just last year. With a sinking feeling in her stomach, Grace realized the truth she had been subconsciously avoiding. Eric had another family. In a daze, Grace began to investigate further. She turned on the second phone and found it was still active. There were hundreds of text messages between Eric and a woman named Laura Bennett, filled with endearments and discussions of everyday family life. Grace read about school plays, doctor's appointments, and plans for family vacations. Each message was like a knife to her heart. Using the information gleaned from the messages, Grace took to the internet. It didn't take long to find Laura Bennett on social media. Her profile was mostly private, but Grace could see enough to confirm her worst fears. There were check-ins at restaurants in Charleston, South Carolina, during times when Eric was supposedly on business trips. There were vague posts about loving her family, always carefully worded to not mention a husband directly. As the reality of the situation sank in, Grace felt a range of emotions wash over her. Shock, betrayal, anger, and a deep aching sadness. The life she thought she had, the husband she thought she knew, had all been a carefully constructed lie. She spent hours poring over Eric's credit card statements, finding regular charges in Charleston that he had always explained away as business expenses. She discovered a separate bank account she'd known nothing about, regular transfers to an account in Laura's name. As night fell, Grace sat in the dark living room, surrounded by the evidence of her husband's deceit. The home that had once been her sanctuary now felt tainted. Every happy memory was called into question. She knew she had a decision to make. Did she confront Eric immediately? Consult a lawyer? Try to reach out to Laura? Little did Grace know her discovery was just the beginning. The choices she would make in the coming days would set in motion a series of events that would have fatal consequences for more than one person in this tangled web of secrets and lies. As Grace delved deeper into her investigation, a clearer picture of Eric's secret life emerged. Laura Bennett, age 34, was a pediatric nurse at USC Children's Hospital in Charleston. She had met Eric 8 years ago when he was in Charleston for an extended consulting project. Their whirlwind romance had resulted in Laura becoming pregnant within months of their meeting. Eric, already married to Grace for 4 years at that point, had made the fateful decision to lead a double life rather than come clean to either woman. Eric had told Laura that his job required him to split his time between Charleston and Savannah, explaining his long absences. To maintain the charade, he had even purchased a modest home in a Charleston suburb, under an LLC, creating a part-time residence for his second family. The children, Ethan and Sophia, believed their father's story about his demanding job. To Laura and the kids, he was a devoted family man who did his best to be present despite his challenging career. Grace found herself obsessively comparing her life with Laura's. While she and Eric lived in a large, beautifully appointed home, Laura and the children had a smaller, cozier house. Where Grace and Eric attended glamorous corporate events, Laura's social media showed a life filled with children's birthday parties, little league games, and family barbecues. Stark differences between the two lives Eric led were astounding. With Grace, he was the ambitious, polished executive. Family photos showed him in tailored suits at charity galas and on exotic vacation. But photos from his life with Laura portrayed a more relaxed, casual version of Eric. A man in jeans and t-shirts building sandcastles and pushing swings. Grace couldn't help but wonder if this other life, this other version of Eric, was more real than the one she knew. Had their entire marriage been a performance on his part? The Eric she knew would never have been content with the simple domestic life he seemed to have with Laura. Or had she never really known him at all? As she continued to uncover more details about Eric's secret family, Grace's emotions fluctuated between rage, heartbreak, and a bizarre sense of fascination. She found herself wondering about Laura. Was she also a victim in this deception? Or had she known about Grace all along? And what about the children? Innocent parties who had no idea their entire family life was built on a foundation of lies. The more Grace learned, the more she realized that confronting Eric wouldn't just be about her own hurt and betrayal. Her actions would have far-reaching consequences, potentially destroying the lives of 2 young children who had done nothing wrong. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on her, making the decision of what to do next feel impossibly heavy. After days of internal turmoil, Grace finally decided she couldn't continue living a lie. She needed answers, and she needed them from Eric. She chose a Friday evening when he was due to return from a business trip to confront him. Grace spent the day in a state of high anxiety, rehearsing what she would say, imagining his responses, and trying to prepare herself for every possibility. When Eric walked through the door at 7 p.m., his welcoming smile faltered as he saw Grace sitting rigidly on the living room couch. The shoebox and pile of evidence were laid out on the coffee table before her. The color drained from his face as he realized his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. "We need to talk," Grace said, her voice trembling slightly despite her efforts to remain calm. "I know about Laura and the kids. I know everything." For a moment, Eric stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mask of shock and fear. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, he moved into damage control mode. He approached Grace, his hands held out in a placating gesture. "Honey, I can explain. It's not what you think." But Grace was beyond placation. Months of suspicion, followed by days of agonizing certainty, had left her raw and angry. She erupted, her voice rising as she hurled questions and accusations at her husband. How long had this been going on? How could he betray her like this? Did he ever really love her? Or was their entire marriage a lie? Eric's responses came in a jumble of excuses and apologies. He hadn't meant for it to happen. He felt trapped. He loved both his families in different ways. He'd always intended to find a way to end things with Laura. But then the children came along. He was sorry, so sorry. As the argument escalated, Grace noticed a change come over Eric. His initial shock and remorse gave way to a cold, calculating look. When Grace mentioned going to Laura with the truth, Eric's demeanor changed entirely. His voice took on a threatening edge as he told Grace to think very carefully about her next move. Suddenly, Grace realized she was seeing a side of Eric she'd never known existed. This wasn't the man she'd married, the man she thought she knew better than anyone in the world. This was a stranger, capable of living a lie for years, of deceiving everyone around him. For the first time, she felt a flicker of fear. The confrontation ended abruptly when Eric, his face contorted with a mixture of anger and panic, stormed out of the house. Grace heard his car start up and peel out of the driveway. She was left alone in the echoing silence of their home, surrounded by the debris of their shattered life. In the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, Grace felt numb. She moved through the house in a daze, alternating between bouts of uncontrollable tears and periods of eerie calm. She called in sick to work and spent days in a fog, barely eating or sleeping, replaying the confrontation over and over in her mind. Eric didn't return home. At first, Grace assumed he had gone to Laura to warn her, or perhaps to finally choose his other family over his life with Grace. But as days passed with no word from Eric, no charges on their joint credit cards, and no activity on his main cell phone, a new worry began to gnaw at her. Where was Eric? What was he planning? The man she had confronted was not the Eric she knew, and she had no idea what he might be capable of. As the silence stretched on, Grace's worry turned to fear. She hadn't told anyone about what she had discovered or about the confrontation. Now, with Eric missing and her world in shambles, she realized she was alone with a secret that felt too big, too dangerous to keep to herself. Little did Grace know, her decision to finally share what she knew would set in motion a chain of events that would lead to consequences far more dire than she could have ever imagined. 5 days after the confrontation, with still no word from Eric, Grace finally broke her silence. She reached out to Eric's younger sister, Hannah, the family member she felt closest to. Over coffee at a quiet cafe, Grace poured out the whole story. Hannah listened with growing horror, her face pale and drawn as Grace revealed the extent of Eric's deception. Hannah's shock quickly turned to action, convinced that Eric's disappearance was cause for serious concern. She insisted they go to the police. Despite Grace's reluctance, fearing the public exposure of their private tragedy, she agreed. The police took the report seriously. Detective James Carter, a veteran of the force with a reputation for solving complex cases, was assigned to the investigation. He listened intently as Grace recounted the events leading up to Eric's disappearance. The revelation of the secret family raised immediate red flags for the experienced detective. Laura Bennett, shell-shocked by the revelations, initially refused to speak to anyone. But as the investigation progressed, she had no choice but to cooperate with the police. Her statement painted a picture of a loving partner and father, a man who had never given her reason to suspect he had another life. As Detective Carter dug deeper, more inconsistencies in Eric's life came to light. Financial records showed large sums of money being moved around in ways that didn't match his known income. Colleagues reported that some of Eric's claimed business trips didn't align with company records. The image of Eric Reynolds as a successful, honest businessman began to crumble under the weight of mounting evidence of fraud and deception. 2 weeks into the investigation, a potential breakthrough came when Eric's car was found abandoned at a parking garage near Savannah Hilton Head International Airport. Security footage showed Eric entering the garage, but no cameras had captured him leaving. This discovery only deepened the mystery. Had Eric fled the country? Was he hiding somewhere, waiting for the scandal to blow over? Or had something more sinister occurred? As the investigation intensified, the strain began to show on both Grace and Laura. Grace, once a fixture in social circles, became a virtual recluse, leaving her house only when absolutely necessary. Laura, struggling to maintain normalcy for her children, took a leave of absence from work as the stress of the situation became overwhelming. The chain of events set in motion by Grace's discovery had already irrevocably altered many lives. But as the search for Eric continued, no one could have predicted the dark turn things were about to take. As weeks turned into months, Detective Carter and his team continued to dig into every aspect of Eric Reynolds' life. What they uncovered painted a picture of a man who had been living on the edge of discovery for years, juggling not just 2 families, but a complex web of financial fraud. Interviews with Eric's colleagues revealed a pattern of discrepancies in his work history. Paul Wilkins, fellow consultant, recalled instances where Eric had claimed to be at client meetings that Wilkins knew had never taken place. He had always admired Eric's ability to bring in new business, but now he wondered if those clients had ever really existed. Eric's financial records told an even more damning story. Forensic accountants discovered an elaborate Ponzi scheme Eric had been running for years. He had been using his position to create fake consulting contracts, then using money from new investors to pay off older ones, while skimming large sums for himself. This explained how he had been able to maintain 2 households and fund his lavish lifestyle. As the truth about Eric's fraudulent activities came to light, many of his former friends and associates found themselves under scrutiny. Grace, still reeling from the destruction of her marriage, was now faced with the possibility that everything in her life with Eric had been built on criminal activity. She spent hours talking with lawyers, trying to understand the extent of her legal exposure. Though she had been unaware of Eric's illegal activities, she feared that her comfortable lifestyle might have been funded by stolen money. Meanwhile, in Charleston, Laura was grappling with her own version of this nightmare. The life she had built with Eric, the father of her children, was crumbling around her. She was questioned repeatedly by police, her every interaction with Eric over the years scrutinized for clues. The hardest part was explaining to Ethan and Sophia why their father wasn't coming home, and why people were saying bad things about him on TV. As the investigation progressed, a clearer timeline of Eric's last known movements began to emerge. Security footage from the airport parking garage where his car was found showed Eric entering on the night of his disappearance, carrying a large duffel bag. However, no footage showed him leaving the garage or entering the airport terminal. This led to a thorough search of the parking garage, including areas not covered by cameras. It was during this search that investigators made a grim discovery. Hidden in a seldom-used stairwell, they found Eric's duffel bag. Inside were his wallet, phone, and a handwritten note. The contents of the note sent shockwaves through everyone involved in the case. In it, Eric confessed to his fraudulent activities and expressed remorse for the pain he had caused both his families. He wrote of feeling trapped and of the constant fear of discovery that had dominated his life for years. The note ended with a chilling statement. "By the time you read this, I'll be gone. It's better this way. I'm sorry for everything." The discovery of the note changed the direction of the investigation. Was this a suicide note? Eric taken his own life? If so, where was his body? Or was this a final deception in a life full of lies, meant to throw investigators off his trail while he escaped to start yet another new life somewhere else? As the search for Eric Reynolds entered a new phase, ripple effects of his actions continued to spread. Lives had been upended, fortunes lost, and reputations ruined. The full extent of the damage was yet to be revealed, and the body count was about to rise. 3 months after Eric's disappearance, the investigation took a dark and unexpected turn. Paul Wilkins, Eric's colleague, who had spoken to the police about discrepancies in Eric's work claims, was found dead in his home. At first glance, it appeared to be a tragic accident. Wilkins had apparently fallen down the stairs after a night of heavy drinking. However, certain details didn't add up. Detective Carter, now leading a task force dedicated to the Reynolds case and its offshoots, approached the scene with suspicion. The position of Wilkins' dead body seemed off for an accidental fall. Moreover, Wilkins was known to be a social drinker, not prone to excess. Thorough forensic examination revealed traces of a powerful sedative in Wilkins' system, one not prescribed to him. As the investigation into Wilkins' death progressed, a chilling theory began to take shape. Had someone silenced Wilkins to prevent him from revealing more about Eric's fraudulent activities? Timing was certainly suspicious. Wilkins had been scheduled to give a more detailed statement to the police the very next day. The news of Wilkins' death sent shockwaves through those who had known Eric and had been interviewed by the police, or were scheduled to be. People began to look over their shoulders. The story that had started as a salacious tale of a double life had now turned deadly. Grace, already struggling with anxiety and depression in the wake of Eric's disappearance, became nearly paralyzed with fear. She had never known Wilkins well, but the idea that someone connected to Eric's case had died violently terrified her. She installed a security system in her home and rarely ventured out. In Charleston, Laura faced her own set of fears. She had her children to think of, and the idea that they might be in danger because of their connection to Eric was almost unbearable. As the police dug deeper into Wilkins' death, they discovered that he had been compiling his own file on Eric's activities. His home office had been thoroughly searched before the police arrived. The searchers had overlooked a hidden safe. Inside, detectives found documents suggesting that Eric's fraud went even deeper than they had initially suspected, potentially involving offshore accounts and connections to organized crime. The death of Paul Wilkins marked a turning point in the case. What had begun as a story of infidelity and financial fraud had now become a potential murder investigation. And as tensions rose and fear spread, it would not be the last life claimed by the fallout from Eric Reynolds' web of lies. In the weeks following Wilkins' death, a palpable sense of fear gripped everyone connected to the Eric Reynolds case. The police increased patrols where Laura and the children lived, but it did little to calm nerves. Threats began to surface. Grace received anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night, with only heavy breathing on the other end of the line. Laura found her car vandalized, the word liar scratched into the paint. Eric's former boss at the consulting firm received a package containing a dead rat. The investigation into Wilkins' death led to more questions than answers. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood showed a nondescript van parked near Wilkins' house on the night of his death, but the license plate was obscured. Interviews with Wilkins' neighbors turned up reports of a stranger asking questions about Wilkins in the days leading up to his death, but descriptions of the man were vague and contradictory. As the pressure mounted, cracks began to show in the facade of those closest to the case. Hannah, Eric's sister, had a public meltdown in a local supermarket, screaming at a cashier who she thought was staring at her. Laura's oldest child, Ethan, was suspended from school for getting into a fight with a classmate who had taunted him about his missing father. Detective Carter and his team worked around the clock, chasing down every lead, no matter how small. They were convinced that the key to unraveling the entire mystery lay in the missing pieces of Eric's financial records. But every time they thought they were close to a breakthrough, they hit another dead end. The case had become a powder keg, tensions rising with each passing day. All it would take was one spark to set off an explosion. That spark was about to come in the form of another shocking death. The second death came 6 weeks after Paul Wilkins' murder. and this time it struck much closer to home. Hannah Reynolds, Eric's younger sister and the person who had first encouraged Grace to go to the police, was found dead in her apartment. Unlike Wilkins' death, there was no attempt to disguise this as an accident. Hannah had been strangled, her apartment ransacked. The brutality of the crime scene shocked even seasoned detectives. It was clear that the killer had been searching for something, but whether they had found it remained a mystery. The news hit Grace like a physical blow. Hannah had been her closest confidant throughout this ordeal, the one person who seemed to understand the complex emotions Grace was grappling with. Now, she was gone. Another victim of the chaos Eric had unleashed. Laura, upon hearing the news, made the difficult decision to move her children to her parents' home in rural South Carolina. The danger felt too close, too real, and her maternal instincts screamed at her to protect her children at all costs. As the investigation into Hannah's murder progressed, a disturbing theory began to take shape. Hannah had been compiling her own dossier on Eric's activities, driven by a mix of disbelief, anger, and a desire to understand how her brother could have lived such an elaborate lie. Had she uncovered something that made her a target? The police found Hannah's laptop missing from her apartment, and her cloud storage had been wiped clean just hours before her estimated time of death. Whatever Hannah had discovered, someone had gone to great lengths to ensure it didn't get out. The double blow of Wilkins's and Hannah's deaths sent shockwaves through law enforcement. The FBI was officially brought into the case, as it now clearly extended beyond the jurisdiction of local police. Special Agent Carla Mendez, a veteran of high-profile white-collar crime investigations, was assigned to work with Detective Carter. As Mendez dug into the case, she began to see patterns that suggested this was bigger than just Eric Reynolds. Financial fraud, murders, the professional hits disguised as accidents. It all pointed to organized crime involvement. Had Eric gotten in over his head with dangerous people? Or was he more deeply involved in criminal activities than anyone had suspected? With 2 murders now linked to the case, pressure to find Eric, dead or alive, intensified. But the man who had managed to lead a double life for years was proving just as elusive in his disappearance. As the investigation entered a new phase, those left in Eric's wake could only wait in fear, wondering who might be the next target. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. A hiker in a state park some 50 miles from Savannah stumbled upon an abandoned cabin. Inside, he found evidence of recent occupation and a wall covered in newspaper clippings. The hiker, spooked by the scene, called the police. When Detective Carter and Agent Mendez arrived at the cabin, they knew immediately they had found something significant. Hidden under a loose floorboard, they discovered a laptop that they later confirmed belonged to Hannah Reynolds. It was the first real lead they'd had in weeks. As forensic experts began to comb through the cabin and its surroundings, Grace received a phone call that chilled her to the bone. It was Eric. His voice was ragged, barely recognizable. He told her he needed to see her, to explain everything. Against her better judgment, driven by a desperate need for answers, Grace agreed to meet him. The meeting point was an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Grace, her heart pounding, entered the dilapidated building. She had tipped off Detective Carter about the meeting, and she knew the police were surrounding the area. She still felt terrifyingly vulnerable. Eric emerged from the shadows, a ghost of the man she had married. He was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his once immaculate appearance now ragged and unkempt. For a moment, neither spoke, the weight of all that had happened hanging heavily between them. Finally, Eric began to talk. The words poured out of him in a torrent. He spoke of getting involved with a criminal organization years ago, using his consulting job as a cover for money laundering. At first, it had just been about the thrill and the extra money. Soon he was in too deep to get out. His voice broke as he talked about Laura and the kids, about how he had genuinely fallen in love with his second family. He had tried to keep them separate from his criminal activities, to give them the normal life he felt he could never fully provide for Grace. As Eric talked, Grace felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Anger, pity, disgust, and a lingering echo of the love she had once felt for this man. But mostly, she felt a deep, aching sadness for all the lives destroyed by Eric's choices. Suddenly, Eric's demeanor changed. He mentioned Hannah and Wilkins, his eyes taking on a wild, paranoid look. He was convinced they were coming for him, and nowhere was safe. Alarmed by his erratic behavior, Grace tried to calm him down to convince him to turn himself in. At that moment, the sound of police sirens filled the air. Eric panicked and pulled out a gun. Grace hadn't even realized he was armed. She raised her hands trying to talk him down, but Eric was beyond reason. He waved the gun erratically, shouting about how he couldn't go to prison. What happened next occurred in a matter of seconds, but would play out in slow motion in Grace's nightmares for years to come. Police burst in, ordering Eric to drop his weapon. Eric, his face contorted in anguish, turned the gun on himself. A shot rang out. In the chaos that followed, as police swarmed the scene and paramedics rushed in, Grace stood frozen, watching as the final act of Eric Reynolds' tragic story played out before her eyes. In the days and weeks following the confrontation at the abandoned factory, full extent of Eric Reynolds' crimes came to light. The laptop found in the cabin provided a wealth of information, unraveling a complex web of financial fraud, money laundering, and connections to organized crime that spanned more than a decade. Eric had survived his suicide attempt, but was left in a coma. He would never stand trial for his crimes, never have to face the people whose lives he had destroyed. For many, this felt like a final injustice. The criminal organization Eric had been involved with was exposed, leading to a series of arrests. It turned out that Wilkins and Hannah had been killed not by Eric, but by members of this organization. Fearing exposure, Grace, her life forever altered, decided to leave Savannah. Laura and her children remained in South Carolina, struggling to rebuild their lives away from the spotlight. The ripple effects of Eric's decisions would be felt for years to come, but for Grace, one thing was certain. The man she had once loved was gone, leaving only a trail of devastation in his wake.